and we have two experts in incident management and identification with us. We have Larry Lancaster, who spoke earlier, the founder of Zebrium, the AI-powered log monitoring and incident monitoring service. And we have Ramin Khatibi, experienced SRE, with some fantastic tips that we saw. And one thing that was interesting to me was that, Larry, you mentioned that you don't come from kind of the same kind of sysadmin or ops background. You come from a data and AI background.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
So we, in discussions earlier, we were talking about some of the things that kind of we like about the process that we've seen, some of the things we didn't like. And it was interesting to me, the disappointment of seeing that it's still all about logs and indexers and things like that you're trying to solve. Right. What else did you see when coming to this domain that interested you or gave you more positive responses?
That's an interesting question. I feel like it didn't, so what really has struck me about sort of the modern reality of DevOps and SRE life has been, as I've gotten to know more of you, has been this sort of deep shared responsibility for something that you didn't make, that you can't necessarily fix. Of course, that's always been the case. There's always been sort of support or IT roles. 20, 30 years ago, there were those things. And there's some of that. But I think now you have very sharp people being put into a context where, yeah, sure, if there's a bug, maybe it's not your fault, but your job is to keep this whole application running for potentially millions of users. Certainly hundreds is not uncommon. I think, I don't know, I guess I'm driven by sort of a sense of empathy for that, because it's like, it shouldn't be that way without help. Like it's like you want help. You need, you know what I'm saying? You need help. Like you need tools that respect that responsibility, that respect your time, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's fascinating because it touches on so much of what, I've been in software engineering for a couple of decades now, decades. But sounds like a couple of days. But as the longer time you spend in it, the more you realize how much more it is about people than about technology.
Yeah.
And is that with Ramin, how when it comes to things like empathy and handling responsibility within teams, how have you seen that kind of managed well or badly?
So I was a manager briefly in '99, and I had no empathy, and I did it poorly. So that's why I'm actually a senior staff SRE at my last job rather than going into management. Though I think the last 10 years I've actually worked for a couple of managers that did it well. I do like that the industry seems to be getting better at management. I often thought as the industry grew so quickly, they would promote somebody and be like, "You're a manager." That person had no skill. Their manager had no skill to manager. Their manager had no skill as a manager, and generally the manager on your team was the most unqualified for the job. I think that started to change. I think it still pops up in the industry more than I would like. And you're a little bit stuck because you do have to have some deep technical knowledge, I think, to manage well, particularly kind of your line manager. As you go up the stack, maybe yes, maybe no. Generally, I've done better with managers that have deep technical knowledge, just because you can have that conversation you need to have, particularly if you disagree with other teams. But what I was surprised was I had a manager a couple of years ago, and they not very empathetic, but he instituted all the processes. And he's like, "I'm gonna have one-on-ones. I'm gonna keep the doc. I'm gonna care about your career." And he kind of treated it like a check mark. And I think personally he didn't feel it in his heart, but he faked it enough where it worked better than people who considered themselves people managers. So I thought that was interesting. Of doing the things was actually maybe more important than feeling them.
That's a really good point. Of that, especially because it applies to so much, especially in this industry, in terms of. As I was talking earlier, actually. We continually try and make it up as we go along as an industry, and fail to learn from other disciplines, other industries, and realizing, you know what, people have done this before. These are the standard processes. Maybe I should try following them. Makes a great deal of sense. So when it comes to those kind of processes, how have you found, what kinds of, when you're evaluating processes to take on board as an SRE, I mean, you've got all these different ones. What are the particular traits that you either look for or learn to avoid?
Sure. I think I'll talk a little bit about resilience engineering, which is somewhat kind of new in the field. John Alspaugh, who I overlapped with a little bit when I was at Yahoo, is kind of, that's his new kick. So him, Eric Hofnagel, a bunch of kind of the people I mentioned are in that space. And what they've done is they're like, you've got a bunch of process, and when things go wrong, people have broken those processes. And then when things go right, people have broken those processes. And they're really starting to look at, like, your people are the resilient part of your network. And there's something called a work to rule strike, which I read about a couple of years ago, and it's hilarious. It's I think Italian bus drivers used to do it, and they would run exactly by the book, and everything would take 5 times longer. And they're like, no, we're doing exactly what you told us to do, and it sucks. But that was the point of, like, you pay us to be thinking people, and you're trying to take that away.
And the job is often so much more than what it's originally been described as.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the first managers I worked at like around 2000, he said, figure out where you're going and create the least amount of process to get there. Which I liked that, but sometimes it leaves a lot of room. So, I don't know, maybe I'll let you talk some.
Please. I'm really enjoying this.
It's I mean, out of the particular processes, as we've been saying, you're something of a newcomer, not an entire newcomer to this world. The processes, are there processes that you've taken on in your work with Zebrium when it comes to founding a company, and especially running an online service, the SaaS, that you've found particularly useful?
Yeah, I'm not a big process guy. It's interesting because I'm kind of a tech guy. I'm kind of like, I'm at my, like this, until like 3 a.m, and I don't like going to meetings, and I don't like scheduling them when they're hierarchical. I like the kind where there's a space, or at least, even if someone's remote, like just hop on a Zoom and talk, go through things. I like that kind of me. I like to make room for that. Processes. I guess, in a small company, you don't need a lot of process. You need really sharp people, and you need to treat them with respect, right? So I guess I'm a bad expert on process. But.
Well, no, that's actually, it's kind of one of the most founding principles of the best ways I've seen Agile described. The kind of pillars of Agile is, one of them is basically respect for people, and respect for the way that people want to work and don't want to work. And sometimes you have to guide them into new ways, but ultimately it's kind of respecting that they have brains and they're going to want a good reason for working that way.
Yeah,
I would argue you actually have a very highly developed process. It's distributed. It's like sort of organic. And the problem I've run into is you do that at a startup, everything's running great, you get bought by a company. And they're like, what's your process? And you're like, well, we just know. And they're like, how could you, like, where is it? And you're like, but we know. And we couldn't articulate, and so they gave us their process, and everything went to hell for like a good 2 months until we kind of pushed them out the door. Like, we're going to go do what we know to do, we'll just write it down first. So to me, it's like, it feels like there's low process, but I would actually think about what you have, if only so you can tell other people that you have a process.
Okay, I'll do that. Sounds good.
Especially when it comes to, onboarding people. So it's, what have you found, Ramin, particularly effective when onboarding new team members?
So the last team I was on was pretty stable, and we maybe onboard one person a year, and then we made a mistake and we onboarded 5 people in a year, and this went poorly. So what we didn't realize was it takes a lot of work. We had a lot of velocity, and we didn't realize how much of a drag that was going to be on our velocity. And we tried to pair people up with kind of your mentor-mentee, but I'd say we half-assed it. We didn't really set a good process. In that, I think making that big mistake was a big learning lesson for me, because I figured, like, we've got a good team, everybody, like, we've got a lot of trust within the team, people pick that up. But you really had to explicitly kind of explain to the team how you worked. Sometimes we had to actually agree how we really worked. I would say onboard more often if you can, but like don't do more than 2 people, particularly if you're kind of like the 8-person 2-pizza kind of team. Like,
right. The measurement sizes of pizzas.
Does that answer the question? Or
It does, especially because I think there's a really good answer that I don't hear enough to many questions about how do you do this a good way, and the answer is don't do it very often. Right? It's like, and it's something in particular when it comes to teams, that there's a particular bad practice that I've seen in many organizations that are composed of small teams, which is that one small team is particularly successful at something, and the organization goes, those people are brilliant, let's break apart that team and move them all to other teams, and so they can all, and like, no, if it's a good team, you keep them together. And
sometimes that works, if only because like, those relationships go with that team. So that was one of the things I said I would say our team actually did well was you need resources from another team. Somebody senior on the team would walk you over, go, this is a friend of ours. Everybody do the handshake, be nice to them. We did that thing for you that one time. Like, you're giving them a certain amount of social capital. And I've seen other teams completely fail. Like, people get launched in our help channel, and they're like, I need a thing. And you're like, who are you? And like, that's complicated. Why do I care? Like, who are you again? And like, there was no kind of helping them digest the problem down to something that would be palatable to us and palatable to them. And
that's and I suppose it's one of the things that is the difference in when dealing with large organizations and then what's going out on your own as a founder is that how large is Zebrium now?
12 people.
And is it are you co-located, or you're all
we're down in Santa Clara, so these are people I have run into over the course of meetups, online stuff, career, whatever. And since most of them were kind of in the peninsula or further south, Fremont, I live in Alameda, but I was like, okay, I want them to come, so we get the autos in Santa Clara.
And when bringing new people in, have you found it? I suppose if a company's young enough, then your processes are kind of up for grabs, really, or just looking for everybody to help evolve everything.
Yeah, I mean, we do Agile, since you brought it up. But I don't consider myself a Scrum Master or anything like that. In fact, I'm more of a titular. I kind of sit in the corner and grump when it needs to be done, and other than that, I try to be supportive. That
is a pretty good description of the CEO role.
Oh, great! I'm getting promoted. It's excellent.
It's and so. But it's interesting, like mention Agile.
Yes.
Do you have you now that you're kind of running a software as a service and your online service? Have you, when it comes to things like outages, have you started evolving any kind of process?
Yeah, for sure. So we run our own stuff on our own stuff. First of all, everything runs in AWS.
Dog fooding.
Yep, and we bring all the logs into another instance from our production instance, and then we monitor it there, and we build features, because that's the best way to learn. You're going to see stuff if you're using it every day, especially when you got a small stack and you're growing it fast. You're going to hit every edge case, and so that's fantastic. Yeah, I highly recommend dog fooding to those who aren't doing it. It's been transformative.
We actually at LaunchDarkly we started with the dog food instance.
Good.
And then we renamed it to cat food instance because we needed the dog food instance needed something else, and so
I see.
And ever since then it's just been referring to cat food.
Nice.
All the time.
I got questions for you then.
Oh, go.
Get it.
Excellent.
So last time I talked to LaunchDarkly, you weren't giving end users a lot of feedback on how many flags were too many, or like how complicated the data. Has that changed at all, or?
We do. We've got. When was that?
Maybe 6 months ago,
Okay.
or at least whoever I was talking to was like, "Oh no, you can do whatever you want." And I'm like, "Oh, that sounds bad."
It's interesting because so I can't speak to what we were doing 6 months ago because I've only been there 2 months. So. In fact, most of the other LaunchDarkly employees who are here have been doing amazing support on this event. Probably know considerably more about that than me, but I will say that that is something we have now a customer success team that is focused on things like that, but also that we're building out more best practice guides. At the moment, our documentation is kind of in the user manual style. We have a lot of blog posts that talk about best practices. And it's something that we're seeing much more demand for, especially because there's not a lot out there, about this kind of thing. What happens with feature flags is that once you start using them and you can realize how useful they are, you start using them all over the place and you end up with loads of them, and that can be a problem. Right?
Yeah.
And then your immutable infrastructure starts to look pretty damn mutable. Like, oh, I did a bunch of stuff in different code paths.
It can't be on fire. It's immutable. That's not allowed. And so, it's interesting because we have some of those problems where we're going, okay, the main app now has several hundred flags, and we should probably be cleaning some of those out. Part of it is about, building the features to help identify the ones that, and we have some for that. But yes, there's continual work in providing best practices. But it's as well, we're kind of learning from the industry. There's a lot of this stuff that we're learning at the same time as everybody else. It's interesting. I've got to ask you the same right back at you. Is there? With your experience with either feature flags or other things related to testing in production, that because this is a new field, this experience or insight is incredibly valuable.
I think something similar for me was I was working on like a sysctl thing where in Twitter we had a bunch of SKUs of machines, and I wanted to be able to tune machines based on like their like different CPUs and a bunch of other stuff. And so we built it, and like you could have these fall throughs and knockouts, and and then it was sort of the person I developed with, we kind of looked at each other and like, can anybody else make heads or tails of this? Or do we vastly need to simplify what's allowed? And it was good we had that conversation because I had done the last thing at the last startup where I was a department of one, and I had built a system that only I had enough context to run.
Right.
And to me, that's what I see with the feature flags is if you've got too many of them, or really any sort of complicated like config system where you're merging a bunch of values and stuff, like does anybody other than you know what's going on?
We are very good as an industry at making things that are too complex for us to manage and to describe to other people. Basically, lots of foot guns, very capable foot guns that we're happy to fire randomly. It's this kind of learning, especially about this. There's one thing I was going to ask and chatted briefly about was about postmortems. And postmortems continually fascinate me because I used to work with a brilliant agile practitioner who said that if you only learn one agile ritual, it is the retro that is the most useful one, because it's where you actually do the learning, it's where you do the improvement. But I'm interested to know the practices that you found that make successful or unsuccessful postmortems.
It's funny because when a postmortem goes well, almost nobody notices. We had an intern, and we had a postmortem. It was a decision I had made like 8 months before, and that turned out to be the wrong decision. And we had a series of comedic errors. And what happened was the app had stopped serving long enough for all the values to fall out of the cache. And then what we realized was we needed to spin up 1,000 instances of an app that normally has 100 or like maybe a dozen, and run it for 14 hours in order to rehydrate the cache. So like comedy of errors, but like we had a good timeline, everybody knew the parts, we came up with the work, like, and the manager kind of sat back and let the ICs like do the thing, we did the thing. And then I pulled the IC aside, or the intern, and I said, this was the best meeting you've ever been in and you have no idea. part of it was like the people working on it had about 5 years of context with each other, and there was a lot of trust of like, this is obviously how we got there. It was odd enough that nobody was like, there was no finger pointing, because you're like, well, that is weird. Okay, like we totally screwed that up. And kind of broke it out for her of like how this all went, and also had that discussion of like, 20 years into my career, when I screw up, I don't really pay too much of a price. You as a new engineer might feel that you can't be wrong, or you're, like I want to get promoted to the like next level or whatever, where I've sort of arrived in my career, like, and and how the team works, like if the team is very uptight about being wrong, then you're going to be uptight if the team is like, yeah, I was wrong. Actually, a former coworker of mine was here tonight, and he had this thing where he'd just say, you're fired, which was sort of hilarious, because like that's the worst thing that like really could happen. And he was just like, oh, you screwed this up, you're fired. And you're like, then you look at it, you're like, oh shit, I'd fire me too. Or I'd be like, no, this isn't my fault, it's his. And like we'd pass it around, and eventually the person would be like, oh yeah, that was me. Like, and that team could do it. And like, I don't think the I'm fired works in general, so don't go try that at work, unless you know everybody for a while. But it was funny, and like this is the worst thing that could possibly happen, and like, and it just was a way of passing like whose problem is it at the moment around, and I thought that was fun. First postmortems though, it's really like, I've been in ones where you have a very nice one because everybody trusts each other, and there's this idea. I've been in ones where like people are just waiting to finger point, and then you're very defensive. For me, it's always having a good timeline from the beginning just simplifies everything, because like you start slotting stuff in the timeline, and now you've got something concrete. We can argue about who did what, but like at least we've got a timeline.
Right. And then of course there's the timeline afterwards in terms of how do you. Well, one of the problems that I've seen with postmortems is just finding the time to have them. Right. There's in a situation where stuff is exploding, and especially if you're engineering at the same time, finding the time to slot in the post-mortem, and then the actual work, the remediation work to be done afterwards can be incredibly difficult. Is that, something that either of you have experience with, or in terms of...
What I've noticed about post-mortems per se at larger companies that I've worked at was that there's two kinds. One is when the team that's present is capable of doing something that will prevent an occurrence of it in the future. The other is when they're not. And so then they have to do something brittle or a workaround, or they have to go complain, or somebody else has to, so a perfect example from my world would be, there's some, this is a great, so there was the Stripe outage, right?
Which outage?
Stripe.
Oh, right. Yeah.
A few months ago. Right. So if you were looking at the logs, what you would have seen was the Postgres replication heartbeat was happening, and then it stopped happening. And then when a deployment happened, then all hell broke loose is how I understood it. I read it through. But who knew to go instrument that message, that particular thing happening, right? Or how to do it. Okay, fine, we get that. So now let's say we had a postmortem. Now we're not Stripe. I'm not talking about that anymore, but let's say that was our problem. We could have a meeting. We could say, Bob, go hook up something to look for that thing happening, and then make sure that an alarm goes off, it stops happening, right? Okay. But while we're having that meeting, there's another service being created. There's another dependency being created. And it's going to have exactly the same problem. And so have I really done a postmortem with a root cause corrective action? No. It's going to happen again. Right. So it's a different class. It's the same class of thing, but there's no way that I sitting there with my knowledge could work around it. And so at those points, people need to be willing to look for technologies or processes or budgets to go and fix or do something at a higher level. And I think that's what makes a successful use of postmortems versus sort of a less successful, more typical one that I've seen.
Yeah, there's typical, sounds like, especially what you were saying earlier, especially about responsibility, that you're giving people huge responsibility, that when there's the continual complaint of being given responsibility without power, and especially in situations, as like you were saying earlier, with that with an SRE, like pull an SRE into the team and somehow assume they're going to magically fix all the problems. And it's just their job to point out the problems.
The other thing I've seen is I've often gone to postmortems to help another team out. Because like we sat down and we did a thing and we knew we had a race condition and we reduced it down to a second, but we knew the binary was going to be missing and they were bad at making RPMs. So I'm like, just do it this way, it'll be close enough. We ran some tests that looked good. So then we get pulled into a postmortem, it's Sev 3, and we go and we find this team had problems in this 1 second window, and 2 of their jobs failed to launch. And we're like, okay. And so let me get this straight. Like we did this thing like across all machines, several dozens of thousands. And we had 2 problems. This is what we call a rousing success. You guys have some work to do. And like, it wasn't about shifting work or shifting blame. It was the 2, really? Like, that's why we're here? Like, out of like literally 100 million jobs, like, go fix your stuff. And we didn't say it that meanly, but it was like, I think maybe you should just have some retry logic and that'd be cool. So you as a senior engineer, like that is a lot of your job is to go like, everybody take it down a notch. We've seen this before, go fix your thing.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, it's great if you can make things relatively standard, keep everybody calm, make it boring. You know, it helps a lot. Is there anybody here who has? Do you have any questions, any comments about any of this? Because you know, this is a fairly small colloquium of gathering of people. Any questions for any of the panel here? We have Cindy, who has. Where is Cindy?
You were saying something about the.
Sorry, Cindy.
Malicious bus, the Italian bus drivers. Very useful term that I've heard. Malicious compliance.
Yes. I think I've heard that before.
Right there.
Love it.
Thank you, Cameron. Malicious compliance. Sorry. Yes. So what? I'm sorry. What was your name? Isaac was saying that the term to describe the work to rule habit, the Italian bus drivers, was malicious compliance. So, you know, doing exactly what they were told to do with malicious intent. And it works surprisingly well because it's only once it's acknowledged how much more your job entails than what you're described as doing and what you're being paid for that people start to notice.
Yep.
Any other questions?
So speaking from the infrastructure side, which tends to be different, the joke we had on our team was you're your own grandpa. Which meant we had no product manager, no project manager, no QA. You generally spec the work, you did the work, you signed off on your friend's work, and hoped there wasn't an outage. And that's generally been most of my career in infrastructure is you do not have the same backup that you do on like front end or back end, like mainline sort of development applications. However, you end up doing a lot of the same work. You kind of figure it out. So that's more my experience is like you didn't have QA to begin with, so you get better at writing tests, you get better at limiting blast radius, you're perhaps a little bit more conservative than you should be because you don't have other teams kind of teaching you how to operate in their world. I think it's gotten better the last couple of years, particularly with cloud vendors and stuff where you're not splitting your time between trying to manage the system and move the system forward. I write a lot more tests the last 5 years than I did any time previous to that.
So automated tests. So doing a lot of there is QA, but it's automated.
Yeah.
Larry, what does Zebrium do for kind of releases in QA and?
Well, we test in production. And what that means for us is that there's the dog food. Mm-hmm. Then we've got accounts that have their own clusters, but they're not always on using it. Depending, there's times a day they don't care. And then finally, there's the multi-tenant instance, right? So that we kind of stage it out that way. Of course, there's internal testing, but it's short. It's like days or a week. And so maybe we'll push some, every week we kind of churn out a new kind of set of cooperating binaries. And then maybe for a few days, if there's some tweaks, we'll be looking at it. And then we'll push it to the first couple, dog food and individual customers. Then finally we'll push multi-tenant. So that's like a rolling 3-week window or so.
And that's a pretty common thing, I think, for this size of company and project. You know, you're not doing daily releases yet,
right?
But there's a kind, especially the kind of gradual rollout. It's not ring deployment, is it? Is that? I can't remember. But yeah, you know, do a rollout to some initial canary instances first.
Right.
The thing, it's as Larry was saying, we're as you can tell by the name of the meetup, we're proponents of testing in production. But there is something I think very important, especially in Ramin's presentation, when he was saying that you've got to make sure you have signal to be able to tell whether something was a success or a failure. There are certain kinds of failure that you're going to immediately know about, and you can, you know, either roll back or flip a feature flag, or whatever it is to turn it off. But there are some kinds of failure that you're not going to know about because they don't involve system failure. They involve users not being able to do something, or possibly, you know, the failure. So you've got to be watching, you know, your user actions. You've got, maybe they involve you've just destroyed your marketing funnel and you don't realize it. So having, you know, numbers and signal for all this stuff, so you can actually spot when something fails, is vital. I still, there's part of me that still really values exploratory QA before deployment. I think especially in new features. But seeing, especially since coming to LaunchDarkly, but also, you know, moving more in an agile direction with my work, seeing the ways in which testing in production does actually work, and especially the way that it uncovers things that you will not be able to detect in staging, right? It's only once you actually get real production traffic that you notice these things, and so preparing for that is the best thing.
The thing I would be aware of is we've certainly said this on our team of, you know, you release something to production, it doesn't go well, you release something to production, it doesn't go well. And then somebody on the team might come and have a talk with you and go, I'd like to see a failure of a higher quality next time. Just because, like, sometimes you're like throwing it over the fence, and like other times you're like, okay, like this was a unique thing that you triggered, yay, learning. If you're just making the same mistake over again, we need to have a talk. And I think that's where you use the automated stuff. Both. Yeah. I mean, honestly, like we do a ton, you know, like I managed Puppet a lot, so it has a DSL, so we're like, run all the tests on that, run all the tests on any Ruby that might be included, like try and compile a catalog, blah, blah, blah. Like, you know, that's even on check-in, then run CI, you know, then you have to, like, somebody has to code review. Like, honestly, it's as much as possible as automated. And then, you know, with that kind of stuff, it was actually, we were getting to the point of spinning up VMs, but, it's really what do you feel comfortable, and if you can fail back and forth quickly, great. You know, you've got more options. You know, a lot of times for me, config management being broken was fine. Like we couldn't spin up new machines, but you know, we'll fix it. Config management handing out the wrong values is terrible because now you've just misconfigured your entire fleet. So we optimized kind of for that last problem rather than like solving for just broken. So it really kind of depends on where your problems are, in my opinion, of where, at least where to do the initial investment.
I think we'll wrap it up there. Marvelous. Could we please have a big hand for Larry Lancaster and Ramin Khatibi?